In houses, your task is going to be to create and use a SQLite database that is going to maintain information about all of the students in the Harry Potter universe, as well as what Hogwarts house they happen to be in. We will provide to you a CSV file of all of the students, where this CSV file is going to contain 3 columns: name, house, and birth, where name is going to be the student's full name, so Harry James Potter or Luna Lovegood. House is going to represent which Hogwarts house that student belongs to, and birth is going to represent that particular student's birth year. Your first task is going to be to take all of this data and write a Python script that will import that data into a SQLite database, where your SQLite database will just have a single table called students that has 5 columns: first, middle, and last, representing each student's first, middle, and last name; house representing the student's house; and birth representing the student's birth year. Now, importantly, not every student is going to have a middle name, for example. So Harry James Potter, for example, here does have a middle name, but Luna Lovegood does not, and other characters might not as well because they either don't have a middle name or because it wasn't present inside of the CSV file that we provided to you. So this middle name column could be null, where there is no value there. And that will be an important thing that you'll need to think about as you're constructing these Python scripts, figuring out how to deal with possible null values that might be present. But ultimately, this is what your table is going to look like: a column for first name, middle name, last name, the house for each individual student, as well as the birth year. So what is your task? What do you need to do? Well, you're going to write 2 Python scripts: import.py, which will take care of inserting data into your student's database, as well as roster.py, which is going to take care of reading data from that database and presenting it back to the user. Let's take a look at each of these now, one at a time. Beginning with import.py. You'll run import.py by running python import.py, followed by the CSV file of students that you would like to import, in this case called characters.csv, that again has those 3 columns from before: a name column, a house column, and a birth column representing the student's birth year. What do you need to do in import.py? Well, first, you're going to need some way to have your Python script interact with a SQL database. And to do that, we can use the CS50 library. So from CS50, we are first going to import SQL, and then we're going to create a new variable called db, which is equal to SQL of SQLite : students.db. In short, what this is going to do is give us access to this database, students.db, and SQLite here is just specifying that this database is in fact a SQLite database. After that, we now have access to this value, db, such that later on in our program, we could write code like db.execute, and then in parentheses, we could include a SQL query, be that query be an insert query or a select query or some other query that we would like to perform on the students.db database. So what steps should you follow inside of import.py? Well, the first thing you're going to want to do is check the number of command line arguments. And recall that inside of Python's sys module, there is a value called argv that is going to represent a list of all of the command line arguments that are provided. And you'll want to check to make sure that the only command line argument provided after the name of the program is the name of the CSV file that we would like to use in order to import data. If the incorrect number of command line arguments are presented, you should print an error and then just exit the program. But assuming the user did properly run the program, as by providing the name of a CSV file, the next thing you should do is open up that CSV file that is given by that command line argument and begin to read it, one line at a time. And for each row, you're going to need to parse the student's name. The name field is not going to be separated already into a first, middle, and last name. You just have a name field that could be a string like Harry James Potter or Luna Lovegood, and it's going to be your responsibility to figure out what the student's first name, middle name, and last name is before you then insert each of those students into the students table of your students.db database. How might you go about doing this? Well, here are a couple of hints. First, as you're reading the CSV file, you'll want to use the CSV module inside of Python, inside of which you might use csv.reader, which reads each of the rows inside that CSV file and treats it like a list. Or alternatively, you can use csv.dictReader, which reads each of the rows from the CSV file and treats it as a dictionary, a mapping of key-value pairs, where the keys are the names of the individual columns, and the values are the values of each of those columns for any particular row. Next, you want to figure out some way of taking a string like Harry James Potter or Luna Lovegood and somehow splitting it up into a first, middle, and last name. And to do this, you might use the split method on strings, which splits up a string into individual words by separating it based on where the spaces inside of that string happen to be. Of course, if you take a string like Harry James Potter and split it up based on spaces, you'll get 3 names in the resulting list. But if you do the same thing for a string like Luna Lovegood, you'll only get 2 names. So you'll want to be sure to check this. You can assume that every name provided to you inside of the CSV file will either be a first name and last name, or a first, middle, and last name, but you should check for this condition. And if the student presented in the CSV file does not have a middle name, then you'll want to use the none value in Python, representing the absence of a value, and which will be represented as null inside of your SQL table, in order to insert that value into the database instead. You can use db.execute in order to insert a new row into the table, and as a result, once you've done all of that and run your import.py script, you should be able to look at your database and see that all of the students have been inserted into the students table. After you've imported all of the data, the next step is to write roster.py, which is going to be a Python script that gets the student roster for any particular Hogwarts house based on the database that you've just created. You'll run this script by running python roster.py followed by the name of the house, for example, Gryffindor. And when you run this, the output should be a list of all of the students in that house based on the data inside of your database, along with their birth year. And so here, for example, is a sample of what that roster might look like for Gryffindor. And importantly, this roster should be sorted. First by last name, so Hermione Granger shows up before Harry Potter, who shows up before Ginny Weasley. But also, within any particular last name, you should sort those rows by their first name. So Ginny Weasley shows up before Ron Weasley, for example. So what are the steps that you'll need to follow in roster.py? First, as before, you should check the command line arguments and make sure that the program is run as python roster.py, followed by one more command line argument representing which house's roster you would like to generate. Then you'll query the database for all of the students in that house, and then you'll print out each student's full name and birth year, sorted alphabetically by last name and then by first name. Here are some hints for how you might go about doing that. Again, you can use db.execute to execute a SQL query on a particular database. And in particular, you can use the select query in order to select particular rows from the table. Of course, you'll likely want to filter that table to make sure that you're only selecting rows that correspond to the house in question. The return value of db.execute when you select rows from the table is going to be a list representing a list of all of the rows, where each individual element in that list represents one of the rows that came back from that SQL query. Each row will be represented as a Python dictionary, where that dictionary represents a row in a table, where the keys are the names of the columns in that table, and the values are the values for each row for those particular columns. When you print out each name, though, also remember that not every character is going to have a middle name. And so inside of your table, there may be some middle name values that are null, which means when you select them, you'll get the Python value of none, meaning the absence of a value, if a student doesn't have a middle name. And when you print out the roster, you don't want to be printing out those nones, so you'll likely want some sort of check to make sure that if the student has a middle name, you're printing out their first, middle, and last name. But if they don't have a middle name, you're only printing out their first and last name only. So you'll likely want some sort of condition that is going to check for that case as well. If you want to open up the database to see what the current values of the individual rows are, which might be helpful for debugging purposes, recall that you can run SQLite 3 students.db to run SQLite on that database, such that you can then run SQL queries on that database to find out what rows are inside of it and what values are contained within each of those individual rows. Once you've written both import.py and roster.py, you should be able to import data from the CSV file into your SQLite database, and then use roster.py to query data from that database to display a roster of all of the students in any particular Hogwarts house. My name is Brian, and this was Houses.